It's a video special from the MOSSAD Files, the weekly podcast, usually an audio podcast, that focuses on strategic issues in the Middle East, especially regarding Israel. And of course, in recent months, the war with Iran. But today, we'll take a shift to Israeli politics because there is now an official election date, October 27th. And often in Israel, and there was just a a series of elections again and again and again when coalitions couldn't be formed about 5 years ago. And the issues seemed to get down to Netanyahu, yes, Netanyahu, no. Would he continue to be the prime minister? Back then, would he return as PM? So again, that's a big issue, but I want to put some meat on the bones. And so we're joined here. I'm Dan Raviv, by the way, former CBS correspondent, co-author of 6 books on the Middle East, especially on Israeli intelligence. I want to talk to Nimrod Novik, not for the first time on the MOSSAD Files podcast. You were, Nimrod, welcome again to the podcast. You were a senior diplomatic advisor to the late Prime Minister Shimon Peres. You are very active in Commanders for Israel's Security, a group of more than 600 retired generals and senior officers, intelligence chiefs, senior diplomats, and advisors like yourself. An impressive group that has consistently taken a stand that you care about Israeli security, but I would say in general, don't go with the Netanyahu coalition course of things. And I remember you even, as a group, writing to President Trump saying, end the Gaza war. It's in everyone's interest. And they did come up with a solution, interim, and we'll get to that. And also, you are a distinguished policy fellow at IPF, Israel Policy Forum. So Nimrod Novik, first of all, welcome. Thank you for giving me some of your time.
Thank you for inviting me. Delighted to be with you.
Yeah, now you and I were in touch even before an article that appeared Monday, July 20th, that you wrote in the Jerusalem Post that I would take to be kind of optimistic ideas. First, the optimism, from your side, that Netanyahu doesn't win, that there'll be some other coalition, some other prime minister. And I think you framed it in your article as to the possibilities that could change Israel's face, Israel's image, what the world thinks of Israel, as well as actual policy facts. And from time to time, you wrote, Nimrod, the 5 of them, all 5, some of the 5. So you're thinking of 5 men who are potential prime ministers, depending on the coalition. So first, just so I understand the rules of the game, did you speak to all of them? Did you speak to their advisors? You've known these guys for years. I mean, how up to date is your information on what they might do, any of them, if they became prime minister?
First, as you well know, it's not just the prime minister that counts. It's also the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Internal Security, the Minister of Finance, and so on and so forth. So when I talk about the 5, which are the leaders of the current opposition, I was looking for consensus among them, as well as differences. And the differences matter and are noteworthy.
But did you think about, did you listen and think about that? You've known some of them for years, or you've literally been in contact with them?
I will answer that, but let me preface just one comment. I'm not sure that they win. I'm not sure that they form the next government. I would say, all else remaining equal, this is the most likely outcome. But in Israel and in the Middle East writ large, nothing ever is all else remaining equal. Never. So nonetheless, because they are leading in the polls substantially for quite a while, for several years now, I thought it's important to lay out what I was able to gather from, and this is the answer to your question, from conversation with them, from conversations with close associates, and from long acquaintance with most of them.
Yeah.
So it's put together, and if you will, also my experience in the Prime Minister's office plays here, because on the eve of elections, politicians don't always spell out specifically their intentions. certainly when they are in opposition, and their job is to out the incumbent. That's their job. Not everything that I point out, they have already spelled out in public.
Okay, some
So
of
if
it is.
if
I'll
somebody
call it.
accuses me
Yeah.
of speculation, I accept that, but I'm satisfied that what I know is roughly where they are.
All right, let's get to it. We're speaking with Nimrod Novik. Again, he worked with Shimon Peres, now at Israel Policy Forum. And so, and you sent me a list even before the Jerusalem Post article. And you know what you started with? You said you believe there will be a proper investigation of the failures of October 7th, 2023. Okay, we got it. Netanyahu's been blocking what you'd consider a fair investigation. Why would it be important to take a good look at that if there is new leadership in Israel? Why is that important?
The investigation might be important for individuals who might be found responsible for failures, for sure. But a thorough investigation is important for a far more profound reason. And I draw back on the investigation of the previous mega national security failure 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War, which had similar characteristics of why we failed to detect, to anticipate, and to respond properly. We had 50 years of lessons learned and implemented, and with time, we seem to have forgotten quite a few of those lessons and paid a very heavy price on October 7th and the ensuing multi-front war. So I think that for a national security strategy to be based not on whims and not on what we want the world to be, but what it really is, a thorough investigation of the decade that led up to October 7th, of the failures of October 7th, and of the events that followed is essential for our national security strategy and doctrine. And I'm talking about national security with capital N, not just military, but overall national security, to be updated to the 21st century, to the second quarter of the 21st century.
Is there any element in that, Nimrod, in which another capital N, you might hope that the findings would truly bury Netanyahu's reputation?
Look, as you noted at the outset, if there is a new government, it becomes almost irrelevant what happens with Netanyahu. He's still facing trial. He still has his own legal predicaments. To me, as a person, Netanyahu, the person, is less important. Far more important is the strategy that he led and instilled in the national security establishment, which is commonly dubbed these days as Hamas is an asset, for which we paid heavily on October 7th. How did we get there? What was the logic of that strategy? What was its failings? And how did it infiltrate, penetrate all layers of the security establishment to the point that they fell asleep on the morning of October 7th with the Hamas assault? So, yeah, Netanyahu is relevant and he was the father of the strategy and so on. But for the country to face the challenges of the next couple of decades, we need to understand what went wrong as a system beyond a person.
Well, that brings me to another one of your points, that you believe that the possible new prime minister and his team would look at the, if you will, two choices in the West Bank and Gaza quite differently. And literally the Al-Fatah faction, or in other words, the PA, the Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah in the West Bank, would be seen not as an enemy to suppress, but as a possible partner, although flawed. And that would be important to keep the West Bank what should you say, more peaceful, inching toward maybe progress, maybe a two-state solution one day? What's your view on that? And really, the other five potential prime ministers and defense ministers and foreign ministers might go for that, a more friendly attitude toward the PA?
Yeah, one of the disagreements amongst them that I point out in the article and in my email with you is that question, the end game. At least one of them is clearly on the record, emphatically opposed to a two-state solution, and that's Naftali Bennett. One of them is wavering, and that is Lieberman. And three believe that eventually, clearly it's over the horizon, but eventually, for a strong Jewish democracy, we need to separate from the Palestinians, and they articulate that in public. However, where is the common denominator? Where is the disagree on the end game? They all agree that the Palestinian Authority is a very important partner for Israel. For some, as the nucleus of the future state. For Bennett and perhaps others, it is in order to spare Israel the need to manage the lives and fund the lives of 3 million Palestinians on the West Bank. But changing course in the way you framed it from the PA as an enemy to be done with to the PA as a partner, but a flawed one that has to undergo reforms. Once you change course on the PA, you uncork Gaza as well. Because one of the things that keeps Gaza from moving on phase two of the so-called Trump 20-point plan is the absence of anyone that replaces Hamas as a governing authority in Gaza. The entire international community long reached the conclusion that the only alternative is the PA, that the PA is too weak and too flawed to be able to shoulder that responsibility. But once you accept the PA as the alternative to Hamas in Gaza, this provides the entire process with international legitimacy. Third parties who are supposed to come in with forces in order to secure the strip, the so-called ISF, International Stabilization Force. Stabilization Force, yeah. Countries refuse to come unless the PA is involved. And even the more ambitious task, a difficult one, of getting Hamas, forcing Hamas to disarm, require a Palestinian entity, legitimate Palestinian entity, that will take over those arms. And Hamas has agreed only once it surrenders its arms, and it has some conditions for it, it will only be to Palestinians, certainly not to Israel, but not even to third parties. And therefore, changing course on the West Bank uncorks Gaza as well.
Well,
neither will be easy, but at least there is an opportunity.
Well, and I just want to point out, just to emphasize here for the viewers and listeners of the Mossad Files, where there hasn't been much talk of the Gaza situation. Frankly, the Arabic-speaking media in your region, including certainly Al Jazeera, have reporters in Gaza and feature killings every day without giving any context that Israel probably was aiming at Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists, but also killing their families or smashing a building. That's what's going on. Every day, call it a war of attrition. It's not in the international spotlight. And the situation is stuck, right? The Trump plan, 20 PP, the 20-point plan, you'd agree, it's stuck because Netanyahu and some of his ministers who'd want to keep Gaza forever don't want to progress in that plan. So you, and probably a lot of your friends and commanders for Israel's security, you would like to progress, please, on that.
Yes, I believe that not just us in commanders, but I believe also the five men that we've been discussing, they all wish to change course on Gaza. And rather than continue this forever war and an open-ended occupation, to bring about a political settlement of the kind that secures that there is no security threat emanating from the Strip. It's not just Netanyahu.
If that's possible, no threat from the Strip. There'll always be Hamas and Islamic Jihad hotheads in
Not
Gaza.
necessarily, not armed, not necessarily not armed, and certainly not with weapons that can reach Israel. And that's a completely different story. Rockets, missiles is one thing, and AK-47 Kalashnikov handgun is a different story. I just want to make sure that I don't do injustice to Netanyahu. It is not only he who blocks progress on the Trump plan for Gaza, it is also Hamas. And for Hamas to cave, it will only happen when the three countries on which it depends for its survival, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, speak the same language and tell Hamas it's over. These three countries forced Hamas to give up the hostages at the time. And mind you, the hostages for Hamas were the equivalent of Hormuz for Iran.
Yes.
The greatest strategic asset. It was forced to give it up when the three countries told Hamas it's over. You have no future if you don't comply. When did they do that? When they knew that Trump will deliver Netanyahu. Until they know that Israel is going for phase two, they will not exert the necessary pressure on Hamas to do what it takes for phase two to succeed.
Okay. All right. That's where new leadership in Israel could make a difference in Gaza, which was a terrible hot war for 2 years after Hamas massacred and kidnapped so many Israelis, of course. You also write about Lebanon and Syria, where Netanyahu boasts that Israel has a security strip holding land on the other side of the border in both Lebanon and Syria. And I think you're suggesting, again, with your knowledge as to what the other leaders might do, that they might handle Lebanon and Syria differently. And it's important, isn't it?
Absolutely. As Israel, we have had 18 years of security zone in Lebanon, from 82 to 2000. These were 18 years where we were bleeding with no result in sight until we got out of there. Hezbollah was still there. The Lebanese government was dominated by Hezbollah, and both were dominated by Iran. With Iran having been weakened some, especially concerning its relationship with its proxies across the region, and with a new government in Lebanon braving to stand up to Hezbollah and say, that's it, your arms, we are not going to tolerate a militia, an armed militia in our midst. The guns are all belong to the Lebanese armed forces.
Okay, and by the way, to a degree, Netanyahu is supporting that. There's even a pilot program to let the Lebanese army move into part of the territory where it hasn't been. I mean, to a degree, Israel's saying, yeah, there could even be peace with Lebanon.
The big difference between the Netanyahu approach and his current coalition and the five alternative, should they win, is that Netanyahu has been dragged into diplomacy by Washington. In Gaza, the ceasefire was forced upon him. In Lebanon, twice the ceasefire was imposed upon him. It was not an Israeli initiative to sit down with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Qataris, with the French, and of course, led by the Americans, and work out a strategy of how do you strengthen the Lebanese government and armed forces so that they can do what they wish, what they courageously pronounce, which is disarm Hezbollah. That's not an easy task. And for Lebanon to be able to do that, Israel is not an objective observer. Israel is an input. And when Israeli ministers, day in, day out, declare that we are never going to get out of Lebanon, we are undermining the courageous Lebanese government. If instead Israel were to stand up and clearly state that once the security situation allows for it, we are out of Lebanon to the last inch respecting its sovereignty, that in and of itself will deprive Hezbollah of its primary internal talking point, which is we are the only ones who protect against Israel. No, your presence, your arms force Israel to be in our country. Once you give up your arms, Israel is out. So let's talk about disarming Hezbollah. So I think that the alternative government will be far more ambitious, creative, forthcoming in expediting the process, not being dragged by Washington, but rather taking the initiative.
All right, let's go back to some domestic issues. But first, some of my listeners and viewers will say, who are these five? So you mentioned Avigdor Lieberman, you mentioned Naftali Bennett. So I can think of Yair Lapid. Well, of course, Gadi Eisenkot, the retired general who seems to have rocketed into the lead in the polls. And I've left one out.
Yair Golan.
You're giving it to Yair Golan, who you don't think is likely to become prime minister as head of the Demokratim, the Democrats, which is the old Labor Party merged with the more left-wing Meretz. But as you pointed out, Nimrod, it's not just who's PM. Any of these could be senior ministers, right?
And Yair Golan himself was a deputy chief of staff of the IDF with 30-some years of military experience. So, yeah, we have former chief of staff Eisenkot, former deputy chief of staff Golan, as well as the very experienced Lieberman, the very thoughtful Yair Lapid, as well as Bennett. Bennett and Lapid having been prime ministers for very short periods a couple of years ago. So it's an interesting group, not homogeneous, but on certain issues, there is a consensus amongst them.
Okay, it's not just not Bibi, but you're also showing that there's a consensus, there are ideas for change. So what about, I didn't see in the list you shared with me that there'd be a change in how to handle the United States and the U.S. public, where people are turning against Israel, and another big issue, the Iran war. Would these men treat Iran differently? What do you see on that?
You called my two shortcomings, and rightfully so. I would say the following about each. One, about the United States. One thing that they will do that is different from Netanyahu is drop the shtick of aligning completely with the Republican Party. I think that there will be a major effort, even though it's going to be difficult and an uphill battle, to regain the confidence and trust of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In both, there is an erosion in support for Israel. So I think bipartisanship will be a theme. I believe that there are changes in the internal agenda, which I lump together as back to democracy, I think will appeal to broad swath of American public and therefore affect party attitudes. Historically, U.S.-Israel relations or the special relationship rested on several pillars. One was shared values, which we have undermined in the last 4 years. Another was common interests. Once we stopped being the regional bully and introduced diplomacy aggressive diplomacy, creative diplomacy, security-based diplomacy, I think there is a shot to start reversing the trend that is so frightening in terms of what's happening with Israel on the American political scene, true with the public and true with the Jewish community.
Well,
On Iran,
before you take a moment on Iran, I just want to point out that your article and your list of potential changes also included more respect for the Supreme Court in Israel, for the rights of judges, for the Attorney General being protected as independent, because in your view and in the view of many people, a lot of democratic functions of the government in Israel and of society have been worn down and eroded. So you think that would be reversed, and that changes the tone too. Okay, but we only have a couple of minutes left. So Iran and the war, keeping in mind the enemy has a vote. If Iran continues to be threatening and perhaps even launching missiles at Israel, right, any strong leader is going to react in a similar fashion, no?
absolutely. Look, they were all united in supporting the first so-called first Iran war
June of last
in
year.
June of 24, a 12 days war, so to speak.
June of 25, I got you.
June of 25. They all supported it, and it was a brilliant operation, brilliantly executed, with very clear objectives. They were all critical of the second war that we are still trying to get out of. Thought that the objectives were totally unrealistic, regime change and all the rest. I'm not sure, as a matter of fact, I'm quite certain that none of them, let alone all of them, they do not have the silver bullet of how do you solve this issue. I don't think anybody has a clue how to resolve it. The only thing that I can say with confidence is that they accept that the U.S. and the international community should focus on a single issue, the nuclear file. They claim that the ballistic missile threat and the proxies threat are of equal importance, is not shared by them or by us at commanders. We believe that Israel is strong enough to face those challenges, and the only one that should be on the agenda is the nuclear file. And there is a belief that at least the leadership before the current war was open to discussing the nuclear file, while rejecting discussing the other issues. I think what they will try to do is coordinate as closely as possible with Washington, a single issue agenda, and maybe in that context, maybe a fairly satisfactory solution might be found to the most threatening dimension of the Iran brutal regime.
And obviously, it's your take, again, based on your Jerusalem Post article and your list of possible, helpful, positive changes, that if Israel emphasizes creative diplomacy rather than just the use of force, you're more likely to get allies also in that effort to put pressure on Iran, right?
Including from within the region, which at the moment, from what I hear, and I hear a lot from interlocutors across the Arab world, they fear that Israel has become a destabilizing factor, not as Iran, but destabilizing nonetheless. And once Israel is back to diplomacy, their awe with our military strength is not diluted by fear of how we use it.
Right, and that might be the direction things have been going. I got you there. Nimrod Novik, thanks so much for spending the time. I mentioned your Jerusalem Post article on July 20th. Of course, you're active in Commanders for Israel Security. You're the Distinguished Policy Fellow based in Israel for IPF, Israel Policy Forum, and a longtime senior advisor to the late Prime Minister Shimon Peres. And you've got your finger on that pulse. So good luck this year. And thank you so much for speaking with us here on the Mossad Files.
Thank you very much for having me.
Again, my thanks to Nimrod Novik. And by the way, a book plug for my book with Yossi Melman, Spies Against Armageddon, Inside Israel's Secret Wars. It's a history of the Mossad and other intelligence and security agencies in Israel. Spies Against Armageddon. And also with Yossi Melman, I wrote an inexpensive ebook called Target Iran, on how the Mossad penetrated Iran in recent years. Have a look out, please, for the Mossad Files with Dan Raviv on all the audio podcast sites. I am Dan Raviv. Thanks a lot.